Danielle, we've been exploring practical applications of yoga in managing stress.
Yes.
Particularly in professions that have a high degree of stress. You're from a profession that has a fair bit of stress. Can you talk a bit about your situation?
Sure. I think we've all been there in terms of workplace stress, but I guess some of the things that you experience are a sense of being overwhelmed by the magnitude of tasks you have to achieve. Also, you don't necessarily choose who you're going to be in a workplace with. And the reality of the world is that not everybody gets along, but you're forced to be in the same place and you may see things differently to other people. Often people who work in a professional and stressful environment are very time poor, so that can be a source of stress. And I think people in all professions at some point will experience a sense of anxiety or inadequacy as to how their supervisors are perceiving them. And this can all be very debilitating. Prior to my current role, I worked in an industrial relations and workplace relations law firm where we often had people coming in and really high-powered, high-functioning people who were completely and utterly destroyed by workplace stress. I mean, the reality of modern life is that we spend at least 5 out of 7 days a week in the workplace. Myself, I can spend up to 60, 70 hours a week in the workplace. So it does have a very significant impact on one's life and therefore on one's mental and emotional health. By way of example, in my current role, I work in a very fast-paced and high media profile field. I currently work in the International Legal Assistance Unit at the Attorney General's Department, and we're often described as the operational area of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade because we're often in contact with foreign officials, which is fine, people are people. But in my work, when I'm trying to get my work done, I'm always having to be cognizant of Australia's international relations and the fact that this could have diplomatic repercussions. I'm also training foreign officials in aspects of international law, and as part of that we need to draft the curriculum, we need to make sure the law is accurate. The laws are changing all the time, so you're having to be on top of a very moving and fast-paced field. And I'm having to be aware of the cultural ramifications of the way in which I teach and train these foreign officials. So I guess all that can accumulate to create a very stressful environment. I will confess to having been in tears at work. I think it can be just a matter of just being very tired and having multiple tasks, competing priorities, and having to be responsible for supervising more junior staff and also having to make more senior staff happy. And I guess that it feeds into something that everyone in a professional workplace would experience, and that's that sense of inadequacy and anxiety as to whether you're doing the right job and how other people are perceiving you and how to manage competing tasks.
So a lot of the stress, you're talking about perception, a lot of the stress links back to perception. How does yoga? Absolutely.
I think perception is absolutely the operative word here, Damien. My background in yoga, and my caveat is I'm no expert, so I'm just like everybody else out there struggling to make my way in the world too. But I guess being equipped with the practice of yoga allows me to put things in context. So I think there's a danger in the modern world and our fast pace of society of being completely and utterly defined by what we do. We spend so much of our life there. And if people are completely and utterly defined by what they do, that can be very frightening if you're having a bad day at work or things don't necessarily go to plan. So having this concept that the self is not just Danielle I-P legal officer, it's I'm a conscious entity and I have a purpose and a function other than my workplace. So that allows me to put things in perspective. If I've had a bad day at work, it's not the end of the world. I personally, through yoga, have a belief in the self being defined by many different aspects, and some of those aspects are spirit, emotion, intellect, and I guess a more subtle concepts of consciousness. And so having that perspective to look at things allows me to be a little more detached from the workplace. And I think I mentioned before, obviously, we're spending a lot of time at work and with people we don't necessarily elect to spend that time with. And so having that, I guess I'd use the word yogic perspective of looking at people allows me to see those other people not as that supervisor who's a bit mean to me some days, or that, you know, that employee I've got to supervise who still hasn't done it, I'm sure they're out to get me. Instead of looking at it like that, I can say, that person is also a conscious entity who is trying to make their way in the world, and ultimately everyone's just trying to be happy. So people do that in different ways, and it allows me to look at that person and say, hey, maybe that person's not actually out to get me, maybe they're just a conscious entity who's stressed, or they're just trying to find their sense of identity in the world too. So you're able to stand back and, I guess, treat people in a different way. And again, I'm not perfect at this, but I do think it allows you to develop qualities of compassion and empathy, because you can look at that person as a conscious entity and not just as a suit who works 9 to 5 and for the big man.
So it's a humanising effect.
I think so, very much.
Yeah.
It's a humanising effect. It's also, I guess, it's a bigger picture. I think we've all been in situations where we've felt a lot of anxiety because our worldview is very much affected by what's going on in the here and now. But a self is not necessarily just defined by the here and now. And having that bigger picture and saying, well, this is just one moment in my life by which I need to learn a lesson and I need to cope and get through. But ultimately there is a bigger picture. And having that bigger picture and that, I guess, a sense of detachment from the situation. Just because you're practicing yoga, it's not going to stop bad or stressful things happening to you. But the key point is how you choose to react to that situation. And you could choose to react negatively if somebody's being negative towards you, or you're perceiving them to be a source of stress. Or you can choose to look at it from a more objective way and use yoga to look at it calmly and objectively, and choose to react differently, which can sometimes neutralise the stressful situation. On a really practical level, I mentioned before that a lot of professionals are very time poor. I'm sure you yourself find it hard to fit everything in sometimes. So I think it's about giving the different aspects of the self, of ourselves as conscious entities and not just as suits. It's about giving time for those different aspects of the self to make up our working day. And one thing I do, it sounds like a silly thing, but I get into my office and I log in and all these diary reminders come up, or you've got to do this here, got to do this there, got to do this here. But I actually diarise time for contemplation. So we'll pop my little appointment box in Outlook, and it will say, please go and make 5 minutes to sit under a tree and think about, you know, to meditate, or to get some context, to look at the trees, to look at the ocean and realise it's actually a bigger world out there than the micro stressful situation you're in. So I actually diarise contemplation, and that might seem like a fairly clinical way of doing things, but my purpose there is to elevate the status of contemplation to be equal to my work commitments. So my needs as a person, as a conscious entity, are equal to my workplace's needs as my employer. Another thing that I try to do is make time for exercise and family, and I think there was reference before to the physical benefits of yoga and the physical yoga, but most of that comes from a stillness of mind and getting a more macro perspective instead of being intrinsically tied up in the micro perspective. So it's about making that part of my day. And I think on a really practical level too, I'm sure now, particularly for teachers, correct me if I'm wrong, but you now have all sorts of technological resources at your disposal. Do you have a BlackBerry or email? Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I don't know about you, but sometimes when it goes off, you hear beep beep.
Yes.
It's quite stressful. Do you find that?
Yes.
Yeah.